In this particular segment, we want to talk about deviant over and under conformity within sports. Deviant over and under conformity really started in the 1990s and the early 2000s with sports sociologists looking at and trying to understand deviant behavior that's specific and unique to the world of sports. So up to this point, we've talked a lot about theories that are applied to sports, but this particular one was made exclusively to look at and understand sports. And the reason is because a lot of the other theories that we've talked about, both in sociology and to some extent in the world of deviance and criminology, don't really address the unique complexities of the people that are involved with sports. And we also know that a lot of the individuals that are involved in sports really are not involved in deviant behavior, but we still want to try to explain and understand why you become deviant within the world of sports and why you do not. So Hughes and Coakley came up with this idea, and it basically said you had most of the athletes were going to be in the middle. And it said right here, this is where most people fall. And if you notice, this means most athletes and people that are involved in sports are not involved in deviant behavior. But they did say there were two types of deviant behavior. You had those that were going to overconform to expectations in sports, and those people that were going to underconform expectations in sport. And so the idea is that if you're underconforming, you're not doing what the expectation is. Those that are going to overconform in sports, meaning they take the idea of what's normal in sports and they take it too far. And that's what we really want to focus on, is how can these two things really help us understand what's going on in the sport. Again, overconforming and underconforming. Now, maybe one of the most important words here is this idea of conformity. Because basically it's saying that there are expectations, normalized expectations of what we're supposed to do in sports. What are those expectations? Well, Hughes and Coakley talked about developing what they called a sport ethic. Not sports ethics. Okay, this is different. A sport ethic are the set of the core norms and values that a lot of folks in power and performance sports really accept as the reason for what it means to be an athlete. Okay, and so these four core norms and values are important to them as an athletic identity. Those four core norms and values are as follows. 1. The athlete is going to sacrifice for the love of the game. Okay? Number 2. The athlete is going to strive for distinction. So you're going to push the envelope and you're going to push yourself so that you don't just embrace mediocrity. You want to be the best. Number 3, athletes accept risk, which is equally distributed to everyone. And the expectation is that you're going to play through pain. All right, remember, we're talking about things that are normalized in power and performance sports. Football, rugby, basketball, wrestling, things like that. And then finally, they're going to accept, quote-unquote, no limits in the pursuit of possibilities. And this is sort of embodied down here, Citius Saltius Fortius. I mean, this is the motto of the Olympics. So you're always striving to push yourself, push yourself. Now that's normal, right? That's normal. What we want to talk about with over and under conformity are folks that do not conform to these four core norms and values. Okay? Here's some historic examples of overconformity. And you can read those at your leisure and kind of get a sense for whether how far people are going to push these boundaries. So why would you do it? Why would you engage in cheating? Why would you do things that are sort of beyond the norms, even in the world of sport? Well, some people have grappled with this idea for the last few decades in terms of why people would do it. And they've come up with three sort of major reasons. One is you want to be involved in the sport as long as possible. You love it. It's who you are as a person, and you want to gain every advantage that you can so that you can participate as long as possible. 2, you want to be the best like everyone else, and because you want that attention. So if you're involved in something like a professional baseball or basketball or football league or something like that, we know that praise is usually associated with those people that uncritically accept those 4 core norms and values that we just spoke about. Playing through pain, striving for distinction, always pushing yourself, those types of things. And then finally, there's a sense of excitement. You engage in overconformity because you're increasing the stakes and you're promoting drama, and this is kind of part and parcel to distinguishing yourself as the best, but you're trying to set yourself apart. Now, the thing that's interesting is that there are certain characteristics of these athletes that are more susceptible to engaging in overconformist behavior. These are individuals that tend to have low self-esteem or really need to be accepted. And so they want to stay a part of that world for as long as they can, whether you're talking about intercollegiate athletics, amateur athletics, maybe even sometimes interscholastic athletics, but you also see it quite often at the professional level. These people are holistically, they're all in regards to being an athlete or being involved in sport. It is primarily who they are as a person. And this is difficult because we know that people that do that oftentimes have great success. But what happens when you can no longer have success in your sport? Let's say you get to be 35, 40 years old. Most folks at that age are not able to perform at a high level in professional sports. Okay? So what happens when things end? And that's when we talk about transition issues, retirement, or for those folks that maybe they were this way in high school and they didn't get a college scholarship or they weren't allowed to walk on to teams. What do you do when you don't make it? Or if you're a college athlete but then there's nothing left afterwards for you to be involved in athletics. These individuals have that sort of monolithic identity, a very singular view of themselves. People that have a singular view of themselves tend to have a greater need to want to be accepted, and you generally have lower global self-esteem. Yes, you're very confident, or you feel very good about yourself in regards to your sport, but the other aspects of your life, not so much. Another characteristic are people that see sports as the only means of achievement in social mobility, whether this is economically, whether this is in terms of kind of social status, or they've invested everything that they can personally into this, and this is what they need to move on in their life. The people that tend to view their participation in sport from those ways, those are the people that tend to be more associated with this idea of overconformity, doing whatever it takes and taking those 4 core norms and values and taking them just too far. Underconformity is the exact opposite. All right, and so then you have those 4 core norms and values, and you either reject, or that's a nice way of saying you don't live up to those particular 4 core norms and values. It's basically a lack of willingness and a choice not to adhere to, quote unquote, how things are done in their particular sports. These are some, again, very famous examples going back to the mid to late 2000s. And so we had, very famously, Ricky Williams, Heisman Trophy winner from the University of Texas, a running back, high draft picked in the NFL, played for a variety of different teams, most notably early on when he was drafted with the New Orleans Saints, and then he was traded to the Miami Dolphins. When he was a member of the Miami Dolphins, he reportedly failed a few drug tests, especially for marijuana, and there's all these famous pictures of him kind of making smoking gestures and things like that. And then it was found that he, one day right before training camp, he left the team, went down to Australia and lived in a tent for a while. And all these things are chronicled quite nicely in an ESPN 30 for 30 called Run Ricky Run. And they really kind of go through a lot of the choices that he made and how these choices, a lot of fans, a lot of sport people, a lot of athletes thought he chose marijuana over the game of football, over his teammates. As a result, from that particular point of view, that would be under conformity. Now, we do know that it's slightly more nuanced than that, but that was sort of how the narrative surrounding Ricky Williams. The Malice at the Palace was in the NBA, and it was a basketball game between the Indiana Pacers and the Detroit Pistons that started with a brawl between the two teams, and then Ron Artest went and laid down on the scores table, and supposedly a fan did throw a cup of beer, and it landed on his chest, and Ron Artest jumped into the stands to physically accost and fight the person that did it. Just a little side note here. Ron Artest is going after this particular fan. It was found out this young man actually did not throw the beer. The beer was sort of kind of behind here and was tossed down, but Ron didn't know that, and so he jumped up and assumed that this poor young gentleman was the person that had thrown beer and sort of attacked him. So anyway, that led to a horrific brawl of which a couple of Indiana Pacers were fighting fans. Fans spilled onto the floor. When you start thinking about 4 core norms and values, it talks. There's a sense of you're striving for distinction, but on the field, not this way. And so the funny thing is, which one's worse? Assaulting fans, or quote unquote, again from his former teammates and people, quitting on your team because you would rather engage in recreational drug use. It's hard to say what's better, what's worse, but Underconformity gives us a framework for looking at and understanding those aspects of deviant behavior within sports. One of the things that we do know is that in some strange way, over and underconformity are linked. We know that the social bonds and the things that tie people together in regards to overconformity, there's a sense of deep-seated social cohesion, and those people become like brothers, like sisters, like family. They're very close. And so that overconformist behavior can become normalized within that very, very small unit. And because that type of deviant behavior is normalized, a way of sort of kind of promoting that social bonding is oftentimes through acts of deviant underconformity. And so this is where you get things like binge drinking, the use of, in male power and performance sports, some of these athletes seeing women as sexual objects, and so you then have different forms of sexual and physical assault, things like that. One important part of the connection between over and underconformity is this idea, this Greek word hubris. Hubris is just pride-driven arrogance, and this sense that the individuals are untouchable, invulnerable, above reproach, which means you've been told ever since you were a young person that you were amazing, and people make excuses for you because you are a great athlete, and they pass you through school. Or if you get in trouble with the law, they overlook it so that you can then play on Friday or Saturdays, things like that. Well, at some point, as you become an adult, people have not taught you the difference between right and wrong, and this sense that I can do whatever I want because I am a professional basketball player, for example. That can start to develop, and that process, that's what hubris is. Can this be controlled? How do we stop this, if you will? Especially when we know that those people in power or in charge of these major professional leagues, or something like the Olympics, or March Madness, or even in charge of the high school state playoff system for football. All these different things, these individuals tend to benefit from athletes that engage in overconformity because it promotes drama. It makes the games, the competitions, and the contests much more compelling. This overconformity is also sort of ramped up by the media. And what we do know is that if the media is highlighting and focusing on these amazing achievements all the time in 24 hours, 24-hour news cycles, then the agents of social control in communities, those things that kind of keep people in check, they're probably going to be swayed by the media's coverage of this. And that's when you have people starting to enable negative behavior. So if you have a young person who's involved, is a great athlete in high school, and they're getting in trouble in the community, and the police officers say, pick them up, take them home, and say, hey, let's not have this happen again. Make sure that you have a good game on Friday. um, excuse me. As that process starts to happen, that's the enabling aspect. That's the breakdown of the agents of social control in that particular community. So I just have a couple of stories. If you think, and many of you, if you kind of think back to the deep recesses of your memory, I know that many of you might be young, but way, way, way back in 2008, Tiger Woods, when he was at the peak of his sort of professional golfing powers, if you will, he hurt himself in a very, very high-profile tournament. And he hurt his knee, and he was limping around. All right, so he's taking that, one of those 4 core norms and values of power and performance sports, that you play through pain. Well, he brought that to golf, and the media representations of it, they called it epic, they called it heroic, and people were just amazed by it. Okay, that's the sense that communities and the media kind of work together, not consciously. They're not saying, "Oh, we want overconformity and it's a bad thing" and all this type of stuff. It's just that's how it gets perpetuated year after year after year. And this is just a little example from it's kind of a story from my life. I remember we moved to a particular town in Texas, and I remember we had just kind of emptied out the U-Haul, and we'd moved in, and the high school football team was in almost like military formation, and there was a truck in the front, and there was an assistant coach with a bullhorn kind of yelling through it in the back, and everyone was marching and kind of jogging and marching, almost like if they were in basic training in the military. And as this mass of young men that had all shaved their heads for solidarity to be part of this football team was moving and undulating up and down every street, people were coming out of their homes and clapping their hands and cheering them on. Now, that's not bad, okay? I don't want to say that people supporting high school kids playing sports is bad. It is not. But in that particular scenario, you can start to see how a community would rally around these young men as football players, and if some of them inevitably were to get in trouble, because young men at that age sometimes do get in trouble, you didn't have those agents of social control. You didn't have those mechanisms to teach people, quote unquote, a lesson, or to keep them in line, to teach them right and wrong. Now, so Jay Coakley, who is a very famous sports sociologist and helped to develop the idea of the sport ethic, he said, well, the solution to controlling overconformity is to redefine the meaning, the organization, and the purpose of sports here in American culture. And that is exactly correct. However, this is the question that I sort of pose for you. How do you do that? That's a great idea, and it's what we need to be doing, and that's the concept. But how do we operationalize that? How do we as people change or redefine the meaning, the organization, and the purpose of sports? It's very, very difficult to do, and it has to start with individual people, whether they're coaches, family members, the players themselves, community members, educators. All these people have to take this idea of redefining the meaning, the organization, and the purpose of sports, even in the face of the 24/7 media coverage. If you think about historically, for young men that are going to sign their letter of intent and announce which college football program they're going to participate in, that's usually in January and February. Well, these announcements are on TV, and a lot of people they have a lot, as fans, have a lot tied up in what this 18-year-old does during this press conference, where they choose to take their talents, ply their trade, however you want to think about it. And that media coverage, we have individuals whose sole job in the media is to cover high school players. And you talk about the ESPN 150. If you talk about high school football, they rate the best high school football players in the United States. Well, when you have a media infrastructure like that, you can start to see how, okay, if I want to be one of those ESPN 150, I need to be very good at my craft, which is not school, but my craft is going to be whatever this sport is, by the time I'm a sophomore or junior in high school, which means I really have to work at it, not just in high school, but starting late grade school and middle school. You have to identify what you want to be a part of and how you want to be a part of it. So this is kind of the whole, that's an example of redefining the meaning, the organization, and the purpose of sports. No longer is it, well, sports is just to build character. And you could really make the argument that that was sort of a utopian way of looking at things, and that was not necessarily ever in play. But we have a very, very complicated youth and amateur sports system here in the United States.